I just want to say thank you so much for coming. I wrote this book, The Life Inside, subtitle A Memoir of Prison, Family and Philosophy. And it's about the years I've spent teaching across different prisons, mainly in London, but across the UK and in some other countries as well. Teaching philosophy, the big philosophical questions. Questions I think are important to everyone in this room and probably everyone on this planet. Questions about whether it's more important to be mentally free or physically free. Questions about time, whether time controls us or we can control time in some way. Questions about power, forgiveness, shame. But I think those questions are kind of extra pertinent when you ask them in a maximum security prison, whether it's more important to be mentally free or physically free with people who are banged up for 23 hours a day, and then someone tells you it's more important to be mentally free. You know, it kind of makes you lean in and listen, and the temperature on those questions just goes up a little bit. And I was kind of just having so many interesting conversations that I compiled them into this book. My interest in prisons goes a long way back. When I was a kid, I would visit my brother in prison, and my uncle was inside as well, and so was my dad. And so it was sort of the family business to some degree to be in prison. Only I'm there with a keychain on my belt and can let myself out at the end of the day. And so this question of freedom, while it's pertinent for my students, I think was also something I was interested in, just in terms of reckoning with the fallout of that experience of having lost family members or become very disconnected from them, and have had a fate that's very sort of different to them, and sort of working through that kind of mental fallout is part of what happens in the book. On my travels in prison, I feel like I've met so many different types of human being, and you really, the lessons are 3 hours long, so and the class sizes are often quite small, and you're bringing in philosophical questions. So people really kind of reveal their personalities in that time, and where they've come from, what they want, what they hope, what they fear, how they survive. And I think one thing I noticed myself kind of cataloguing in the years I've worked in prison is how people manage to find a sense of freedom when it's not there in an obvious sense. How maybe in prison or in the midst of a very chaotic life or a very oppressive political situation, they find these moments or opportunities for freedom. And that's what I want us to discuss today, some stories from that world, and whether you think these case studies that I'm bringing to you, these individuals, are free or not. I did a philosophy degree, and I've worked in public philosophy for a long time, and I'm really interested in philosophy and its many manifestations. My training was in a much more kind of conceptual analysis, kind of analytic tradition. What I became interested in my book was how philosophy shows up in a kind of flesh and blood form. So as you'll see on the board, we've got Stoicism and radicalism. What not necessarily just what that looks like conceptually, but how those concepts manifest in a culture, an organization, an individual, in a psyche or in a soul. So there's a guy I met in a maximum security prison a few years ago, and in the book I call him Wallace. Prisons are very different to one another. There is no such thing as the prison or the prisoner. High security prisons are quite different to open prisons. Local jails are different to kind of remote, rural places. The amount of green space, open space, the crowding, the architecture, there's so many factors that go into determining the unique ecosystem that is each prison. And yet there are things you see again and again, and in high security prisons you often meet people who are doing extremely long stretches, into the decades of time spent behind the door. And Wallace was one of those people. He'd been in prison for nearly 20 years, wasn't getting out anytime soon, and there was just a kind of quality to him that is quite typical of people who are trying to survive that kind of existence. Press-ups in the morning, the bed is made, everything is in its place. There's a kind of systematization of the cell. Everything is clean. Everything is organized. You read your 50 pages a day. You do your 100 press-ups in the morning, your 100 sit-ups. A very kind of regimented life. A life that is about controlling the controllables. When, maybe you were supposed to be let out that morning to go onto the exercise yard or use the library, but the prison didn't have the staff. No one's coming to let you out. And nobody's coming to tell you that nobody's coming to let you out. It's very typical in prison. There's so much you have to let go of. And people that I think who have lived under that unpredictability and that chaos for such a long period of time often withdraw into their own controllable kind of world. So when I started talking about Stoicism with that group, Wallace leaned forward in his chair and had something to kind of connect to there. I was telling him about Epictetus. Those who know the story of Epictetus, he was a slave for a certain point of his life, and often thought he was sort of smarter than the master, often kind of goading the master a little bit, talking about how he's more free because he doesn't have the same number of attachments, he doesn't care about his status, he doesn't have the same vanity that the master would have. And eventually, his master beat him up for it and ended up breaking his leg. Legend has it, Epictetus said at this point, you might be able to break my leg, but there's something in me that not even you, not even the gods can touch, and that's my some kind of spirit, some ability that allows me to respond to how you treat me. So you can beat me up and I can choose to cry about it, or I can choose to laugh at you or pity you, or I can choose to not be bothered. I choose whether I'm hurt by this in a kind of profound sense. And I think that's at the core of Stoicism, is that we can choose whether we suffer or not. And it's also a trope that reemerges again and again through prison literature, from Boethius when Lady Philosophy visits his cell and she tells him that nothing is wretched, only thinking makes it so. That's Hamlet. She says a very similar line to him. Sorry, I'm confusing texts. And then we get Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, his Auschwitz memoir, where he says that between stimulus and response, there is a moment and there is an opportunity. There is a kind of opportunity for freedom or free will. And Frankl talks about, even in Auschwitz, where you were around, awful forms of dehumanization and brutality, you could choose to remember that the sunrise was beautiful that morning, or you could choose to enjoy your one square of bread that you were being given. And so this philosophy of kind of mental fortitude and stoicism quite naturally would appeal to prisoners. When I told Wallace about this, he was quite convinced of it, that freedom was something that you could have just in your mind, even if your circumstances didn't seem immediately free. And I asked him what he meant. And he said, well, at night, when the officers are coming round to lock us up at 5 p.m., I get off my mattress and I just close my door 2 minutes before the officer locks me in. And I said, well, is that kind of control? Is that freedom? And he gave me another example. He said, when he's talking on the phone on the landing, the officers will often give you a warning that you've got 2 minutes left of your call before we get locked up again. And I've learned over the years to anticipate when that 2 minute warning is going to come. And I hang up a minute before I'm told the 2 minute warning. And he said he'd seen someone once who didn't do that and who kept talking. And the officer came and put his finger on the receiver and cut off the call. And he said that Wallace knew that if that was happening to him, he would do something he would regret, and that officer might go home with a broken nose that evening. So he never lets himself get in that situation. He hangs up early. And I, listening to this guy, I said, so is that the same as freedom then? And he said, it keeps things simple. So my question for you is Wallace, as I've described him to you there, the man who shuts his door 5 minutes early, the man who hangs up before he's given a warning to hang up, Is he, in any sense that we recognize, free?
So I think what happens to Wallace is that he recognizes a pattern, and since he can recognize it, then he can control it by stopping himself from getting overridden by time. So in his controlling of the patterns, he kind of finds his freedom.
Well, if you to control an event or thinking, that's not freedom. I would think it's free if the prisoner is on the phone and then the phone gets hanged up and he's free to move on without thinking about it. That's freedom.
I think he has some agency, but I wouldn't say it's actually freedom.
We've met our Stoic representative, Wallace. I think there's another person I've encountered quite a lot, and I would call him the rebel. My uncle first went to prison when he was about 14 and a half. He did 3 months on remand in a borstal, and by the time it came to court, the judge said, "Why has a 14-year-old done 3 months on remand in a borstal?" And it got thrown out. But he was already very kind of in that world, and would be back in prison quite soon after. My mum's side of the family come from the East End of London. Back then, it was an environment where if you were seen talking to the police by your neighbours might stop talking to you, and there was a very kind of us and them mentality. My uncle's sort of he was in and out of prison until his 60s when he died, and his sort of bread and butter was non-residential burglaries, so warehouses, department stores. I'd go to his house and there'd be 300 skiing jackets hanging up, and so that's sort of kind of lifestyle he was living, in which prison was very much kind of part of the routine of that life, and he had many stories from that world. And he loved to kind of tell these stories as well. And when I was writing my book, I kind of wanted to just hear it as much as I could, and I put a microphone on him, and we would just sit there for afternoons, and he would tell me these stories. Often they would really stretch my comprehension, because they were not just about a world that I had only really seen the edges of. You know, working in prison, I go home at 5 o'clock. It's a very different place in the evening, and it's the secret society in prison, the secret world in prison is very much its own thing, which he was a part of. But also he was in prison many years ago, and anyone who remembers the Borstal prisons will remember they all got closed down because of the horrific abuses that happened in them. If you've ever seen Alan Clark's film Scum, or The Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner, my uncle was telling me once about a time he was 16 and he was in a Borstal prison. This is a very kind of, I think the phrase at the time was short, sharp shock to give to young people. So it's a military kind of regime. You stand to attention by your bed is made, your boots are shiny, you clean the floor with a toothbrush, you march throughout the institution, intensive physical exercise. The one problem was for my uncle is he had a real kind of problem with authority, and when he was told to march down to collect his food, he would put his hands in his pockets and swagger as extravagantly as he could, so all the officers saw him. In those days, they dealt with things like that very simply. They would punch you in the stomach, be able to shout at you, etc. I think that my uncle found that quite stimulating, and the next day when he was told to march down and collect his food, would drag his feet, swagger, show as much disrespect as he could. What they started to do was call him last for his food, and when they handed him his plate, it was completely covered in salt. So although he was embarrassing them by refusing to march, they would make sure he paid for it, and he would have to scrape all of this salt off of his food before he could eat it. He still didn't yield, and still was rebelling against the system. And eventually they put him in the segregation unit, which segregation units aren't very nice today, so you can imagine how horrible they were 40 odd years ago. It's just a concrete slab that you sleep on. There's no books, there's no TV, there's no stimulation in there. And in the morning they would come in and bring him a shovel. They would take him into the yard and he would dig a hole that was 8 feet deep. And then at the end of the day he would fill it back in. And the next day they would bring him a shovel and he would dig a hole that was 8 feet deep and then fill it back in. And this would happen over and over. When he was telling me these stories, often he was laughing, and I would sort of get the joke, but maybe one beat behind. And I'd sort of ask him to go back and explain something to me. And it was very sort of uncomprehending. And I said to him, that must have been awful. Didn't you just want to swing that shovel at someone's head eventually? Or didn't you just burst into tears? Or didn't you just lose your mind? And he said, Andy, I just loved it. And I said, what? And he said, I just pretended to love it. I loved it. And I was like, but you pretended to love it. And he was like, yeah, I pretended to love it. I loved it. When they came in the morning, I would spring up off the mattress and say, is that a shovel? Brilliant. Are we digging holes today? I love digging holes. It's my favorite thing to do. Are we going to do the same again tomorrow? Please say yes. And I said, but you didn't really, what do you mean you loved it? And I said, what about at the end of the night when you had to sleep by yourself? Didn't you cry yourself to sleep? He said, I've been digging holes all day. I slept like a baby. And, often I'd kind of leave we'd have these conversations in my grandmother's East London council flat, and I'd be walking home thinking, was that bravado, or is there something I'm just not getting here? And sort of trying to imagine myself into that situation. I thought about, after a while, Camus and his book, The Myth of Sisyphus, which he wrote in Paris in the 40s when the Nazis had a real grip on the city, and it would have felt like there was an irresistible enemy that you could not overcome. And then Camus writes The Myth of Sisyphus about this rebel, Sisyphus. He grassed up Zeus, cheated death twice, and blagged his way out of hell, who is given the ultimate punishment of futility, and that is to push a boulder up a mountain and have it roll back down again, and push it up a mountain, have it roll back down again, and on and on. Much like digging a hole and filling it in again at the end of the day. And Camus kind of reframes Sisyphus as a kind of hero, because his rebellion doesn't just break, his spirit doesn't break when he's given this awful punishment. In fact, it's another opportunity to show his rebellion by doing it with a joy in his heart. Sisyphus knows that the boulder is going to roll down the hill when he gets to the top, according to Camus. Sisyphus is lucid to the absurdity of his situation, and yet he does it with a smile on his face. And this is the last kind of great act of rebellion. And the last line of Camus' essay is, we must imagine Sisyphus happy. And as I was reading those lines, I just heard my uncle, I just loved it. I think it is worth asking if in that kind of autocratic regime, whether you're living under the Olympians or whether you're living under the Borstal regime, that kind of rebellion, is it, in fact, a kind of freedom?
Yeah, I would like to say something. And I'm going to speak from experience, where I didn't allow my spirit to be broken, where I was in a cell, and the whole time I was in the cell and I'd been stripped of everything, and I'd sat there in the cold. I didn't allow any self-pity, any tears. I didn't even use the toilet. I didn't eat. I was just thinking, well, I'm going to get out of here eventually.
I think the rebel is free, more free than the Stoic, because in a certain sense, everything we do is meaningless. And to be able to choose to laugh and to do it anyway, to rebel and laugh in the face of the universe, I think that's a strong power of freedom. Whereas the Stoic he used his freedom to choose a routine that became a new kind of prison cell for him.
we felt that the Stoic and the Rebel were quite similar in where they were free, which is that they were defining themselves for themselves beyond this very sort of imposing context that's trying to define them.
Thank you so much for that. It's an ongoing question for me, these questions, so it's really interesting to see these considerations. My uncle was eventually released from the SEG after a week or so, and he was sent back up to the landing, and at feeding time they called him, and he continued to not march and continued to put his hands in his pockets. They continued to put salt on his plate. Until after a few days, he went down for his food and there was no salt on his plate, and they just handed him his dinner. And I said to my uncle when he told me that, "Oh wow, you'd earned their respect." And he went, "Yeah, they'd given up on me." And he said that in front of the officers on the landing, he turned to the server and he went, "Excuse me, where's my fucking salt?" And so maybe that's something of that rebel mindset, is that we talk about people being codependent. I think my uncle maybe was counter-dependent, that sort of he needed someone there in uniform to kind of fight with, So far, we've looked at the Stoic and the Rebel. This list could go on and on. I've met many happy prisoners inside, people who just embrace the life, the simplicity of it, the order of it. It's a lot of people come from lives that are very chaotic on the outside: homelessness, drugs, violence, difficult family lives. Actually, being in a regime with regular feeding times and regular activities can be something people embrace, and people say sometimes they feel more free in prison than they do outside. That's its own psychological map, I think. The given time, I'm just looking at 3 today, and the radical, I think, is something a bit different, because the Stoic, in someone like Wallace or someone like my uncle, kind of a more rebellious spirit, it's about changing your response to the environment and to the circumstances and the institution. As I think people were saying, that these two figures have something in common. The radical isn't so much about the individual's response needing to change as the system needing to change, and those who seek freedom through changing the system. So what I'm going to do for the next few minutes is kind of outline a position to you, a more kind of explicit philosophical position, which is sometimes known as abolitionism, or transformative justice is sometimes called, although there's a kind of difference between those, as I understand. I suppose just to put my cards on the table, I wouldn't say I'm an abolitionist. I wouldn't necessarily say I'm not an abolitionist. I'm kind of abolitionist agnostic. I think there's some interesting points to reflect on. I'm not quite sure how I feel about it. I just don't want you to feel like I'm selling you anything here. But also, I have these conversations because I guess I'm trying to figure out what I think. So Angela Davis is one of the leading prison abolitionists. There's a lot of voices in America who are associated with this movement. It calls back linguistically to the abolition of slavery, which makes a lot of sense when you consider that the penitentiary movement, the private prison movement, was synonymous with the slavery abolition movement. That for some people, the end of slavery was a good Christian thing to do. It was humanitarian, and for others, it was about finding more effective ways of extracting free labor. And we have that phenomena a lot in the US of prisons essentially warehousing the same sort of people and demographics that would have been under chattel slavery years ago, and extracting free labor from them. And so that's why the abolitionists use that kind of language. There's a really key difference that's important to understand when thinking about kind of radical approaches to the problem of prisons, and that's the difference between those who want to reform the prison system and those who want to abolish it. And I'm going to explain some more of that. But one thought from the abolitionists is that prisons are just sort of fundamentally immoral. It's almost kind of deontological. that as they exist in their current form, they're a form of torture, dehumanization. They make permissible other forms of brutality in society, etc. So we can't find a moral justification for prison. And this might seem like an extreme position. You might also be able to relate to it as prisons are ineffective at deterring, ineffective at rehabilitating, and so therefore what moral justification could they have? You might be sympathetic to this position. What the abolitionist says to the reformist is it won't work. What you're trying to do will not work. The house always wins. You can try to reform prison, but these institutions are so born from power, hierarchy, authoritarianism, patriarchy, all the various kind of toxic elements that this is HMP Pentonville, which is almost 200 years old. It's just in King's Cross, and that's a pride flag on the top of it. A few more cases for that argument are things like if we look at the big landmarks of prison reform, they've often not been very straightforward in their consequences. So one is in the States, they no longer or they don't as frequently use firing squad to execute people or the guillotine, but the lethal injection. This we might say is more civilized, more humane. It's a kind of reformer's success. But one of the ironies is you have far more botched executions now because of the lethal injection. Times where it takes people 7 or 8 hours to die, problems with needles, drugs, quantities, circulation, all kinds of medical issues. You didn't have that problem with the guillotine. Guillotine was quite reliable, as was the firing squad. Surely more brutal, but this is the abolitionist saying, look, you think you're making progress, it's a superficial progress. Another example of this is e-carceration, as it's come to be known. So one of the ways in which they're trying to reduce the problem of mass incarceration in the US now is by putting people on an electronic tag, where they're effectively under some kind of house arrest or curfew. And this means we have less people in prison suffering the horrors of prison dehumanization. But the abolitionist says, well, if you look at this and you start to look at demographics of who gets criminalized for something like drug use, it's often not white middle-class young people at university. It's often people in black neighborhoods, certain drugs, certain crimes. What you're getting is just neighborhoods and housing projects that are becoming prisons, essentially, where people are actually trapped in their own home. So for all the losses of autonomy you get by being lifted from your environment and put into a prison, there's a new kind of obscure, yet-to-be mapped loss of autonomy that comes through this e-carceration, and it's very peculiar, and there's all sorts of sinister American elements to this too, like people have to pay for their tag to a private company, and the company can sell your data and all of this kind of stuff. So they're saying, again, the house always wins. Prisons cannot be reformed. They need to be abolished. And yet, I think the word abolitionism, when you talk to most people in the public about abolishing prisons, this is the first image that will come into their mind. What, so we're just going to let all of the murderers and rapists out onto the street? How is that better than prison reform? And this is where the abolitionists will say, well, abolishing prisons would be the final step of this revolution. It would not be the first step. If we had different ways of practicing justice, different ways of deterring crime besides punishment. For example, we know that something that's really, really highly associated with crime is income inequality. If we reduce income inequality, if we have better mental health provision, if we have better education, better social systems, etc., the problem of crime will be severely reduced, and the number of people committing crime will just be a lot less. It's not that it would be a perfect utopia where nobody does bad things anymore. The abolitionists still talk about the dangerous few, and there may be a case for humanely separating them from people who they may do harm to, but that would look different to a kind of prison setting. Abolition is the end, not the start. For those who are interested in this topic, it's, I think, very complex. It's a very big claim the abolitionist is making. This is a book that came out a couple of years ago that, interestingly, makes the case for abolition from a feminist point of view, which, considering 95% of prisoners in this country are men, you would probably find it counterintuitive to think, why do feminists want to abolish prisons? But the case is made quite interestingly that prisons multiply a patriarchal harm rather than reduce it. The abolitionist is optimistic that we could have communities of accountability. That, for me, is one of the areas of this philosophy which is still very untested. Anyone who's ever been on Twitter during a pile-on and seen communities of accountability will know that sometimes that kind of vigilantism can be far more gruesome than anything the criminal justice system will do to you. And one of the very few arguments I've heard for prison as a positive thing, pro-prison arguments, is that it's within a democracy, prison operates as regulated retribution, so sort of regulated revenge, that actually, if you left it to the public to decide what they should do with criminals, it would get much more vicious. The abolitionist is really trying to bring about a world that's so far away from the one we live in, and I think that's why the way Angela Davis relates to this freedom is that it's inherently kind of struggle, that it's not this kind of blue sky that we can bask in, that actually it's gritty and it's hard, but that's the sensation of freedom for them. So the question I'm going to ask you now, quite predictably, is the radicals. Are they free?
I can't think by definition, the radical can't be free because, if they were free, what are they being radical against? I mean, the fact that they're a radical means they must perceive there's some containment on their freedom.
I like the progression of the talk. So we've got the Stoic, who seems to have freedom and acceptance. And then we got the rebel, who is another level of freedom, where he's controlling his responses, he's enjoying, and he's freeing himself, and he's winning against the system because he's laughing at it. But he's kind of like a rebel without a cause. And then we have the radical. The radical is the rebel, but on a higher level, because they're also getting freedom for everyone else. They're trying to change the system. So they have a rebel with a purpose. So I think of the three, the radical will be the most free because they're freed. They freed themselves like the rebel has, but now they're trying to change the system to free everyone else.
I guess I want to just relax the conversation a bit, just to go in whatever way we want to go in.
Just thinking, I've got a way of thinking about concepts, because this comes to the question which has come up rather a lot, whether anybody's free, if there's restrictions on our lives. And I sometimes like to think of it as concept can be either a sort of on-off switch, a binary, or it can be a dimmer switch, where you have more or less. And you were asking who's the most free, which kind of implies that idea. And I think that once, if we think of freedom as an absolute, you're only free if you're completely unrestricted, then of course nobody has any. So it makes no sense to think of that in that way. It makes much more sense to think of it in terms of, a dimmer switch.
I remember reading Anthony Storr, who was a very well-known psychiatrist, and he wrote a book called On Solitude, I believe. In any case, I remember he was discussing imprisonment as a psychiatrist, and he said that basically if you're imprisoned for longer than about 7 years continuously, you're very likely to have your whole personality just fragment, which seems like a very serious penalty indeed, perhaps more severe than people may think. So it could be almost like a personality execution rather than biological execution.
Do you believe free will is empowering as a notion for prisoners? Because on the one hand, it can provide them with the kind of sense of liberty that we see with the Stoic and the rebel, whereas on the other hand, kind of strict belief in free will has been used to really condemn inmates in the past. If you take like a schizophrenic who assaults someone and you view it from the kind of lens that they have total free will, they may receive far harsher treatment than if you believe more of a deterministic thing. So I just wanted to hear your views on that.
It's a really great question. Thank you. I guess my position is sort of not quite determinist, but towards a kind of free will skepticism direction. And when I'm teaching the subject of free will and determinism in prison, what I see a lot is people are really attached and find it really important to believe in free will and believe in moral responsibility. People are sort of saying, I got myself here, I can get myself out. And so actually part of coping with that situation is almost like a necessary belief in your own agency. And yet visiting prisons, seeing the demographics, seeing the age profiles, seeing how many care leavers are there, seeing how associated with blatant factors like income inequality, early childhood trauma, etc., it really challenges your belief in free will to walk through a prison, or go to a courthouse, see the people who are judges and lawyers and see the people who are getting banged up, and it's really, the social differences are really, really stark. All of that kind of plays into my free will skepticism. And yet, for the people behind the door, most of the time what I hear is, no, I do have responsibility and I can change this. So we're sort of, it's a kind of liberal comedy, really, isn't it? Kind of me going, oh no, don't worry, you don't have any free will. And they're going, yes, we do. Leave us alone. Thank you for being such great company. And I love that this exists. Please watch the show in January. We're really hoping that it will do something for public philosophy. If meaningful, interesting philosophical questions can happen in a prison, they can really happen anywhere.